The Zalari homeworld was already dying when the sky broke. From orbit, the planet looked like a wound. Vast continents glowed with spreading fire where oceans had once cooled the air. The planetary shield, once a flawless dome of emerald light, flickered in uneven pulses as if it were struggling to remember how to exist. Each time it failed, even for a fraction of a second, lances of white-hot energy carved into cities below, turning towers into ash before the echoes of their collapse could even form. Above it all, the enemy fleet hung in silent control. They had not rushed the destruction. They had surrounded it, studied it, and then dismantled it piece by piece with cold precision. Their ships formed a tightening ring, cutting off every escape vector, every supply route, every hope of reinforcement. The Zalari defenses had been strong once, strong enough to deter empires. Now they were little more than burning wreckage drifting through a sky that no longer belonged to them. Inside the Central Command Station, Admiral Thalen did not look away from the tactical display. He had already watched 3 defense lines collapse. He had already issued evacuation orders he knew would fail. He had already sent messages to allies who would never arrive in time. There were no more strategies left to try, no clever maneuvers that could turn the tide. What remained was time, and even that was slipping through his hands faster than he could measure it. Outer shield grid has dropped below 10%, one of his officers reported, her voice steady in a way that made it worse. At current burn rate, we estimate full collapse in less than 2 hours. Thalen nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging a fact that had been inevitable from the start. 2 hours was not enough to save a world. It was barely enough to say goodbye to one. Another officer turned from his console, hesitation visible even through discipline. "Sir, we're detecting something unusual." Thalen did not respond immediately. Unusual had lost its meaning in the past few hours. Everything about this battle had been beyond expectation. Still, he gestured for the report. "It's coming from behind the enemy formation," the officer continued. "At first we thought it was debris, but it's moving." "No, not moving. Appearing." That word made Thalen look up. "Appearing," he repeated. "Yes, sir. There are no jump signatures. No warp distortions. One moment the space was empty, and now there are objects there. Multiple. Large." The main display shifted, zooming out to show the wider battlefield. At the far edge of the enemy's formation, beyond their supply lines and command relays, something had indeed changed. At first glance, it looked like nothing at all. Just a patch of darker space where the stars seemed slightly dimmer, slightly wrong. But as the sensors adjusted and the system tried to resolve what it was seeing, shapes began to emerge from the distortion. Angular silhouettes. Massive. Silent. Ships. They were not broadcasting identification codes. They carried no visible insignia, no markers of allegiance or origin. Their hulls absorbed light instead of reflecting it, turning them into shadows against the void. Even their engines gave off no clear signature, as if they were moving without disturbing the space around them. For a long moment, no one in the command center spoke. Then one of the analysts whispered, unable to stop himself. How did they get there? It was the wrong question. The right question was why. Because the unknown fleet was not approaching the battle in the way any known force would. They were not forming attack lines. They were not positioning for defense. They had placed themselves in the one location that should have been impossible to reach unnoticed, directly behind the enemy's logistical core. A position that, if used correctly, could collapse the entire invasion. Admiral Thalen felt something he had not allowed himself to feel since the battle began. Not hope, not yet, but something close to it. On the display, one of the enemy's relay ships suddenly went dark. There was no explosion, no visible impact. It simply vanished from the network, its signal cut off so completely it was as if it had never existed. A second later, another followed. Then a third. Confusion rippled through the enemy formation. Their tight coordination faltered, their movements losing the perfect synchronization that had defined their assault. "What are they doing?" the officer asked, staring at the cascading loss of enemy signals. Thalen did not answer. He was watching the unknown ships. They moved with a kind of deliberate calm, as if they had all the time in the world. As if this battle, this desperate last stand that had pushed the Zalari to the edge of extinction, was simply another task to be completed. One by one, key points in the enemy's structure began to fail. Supply nodes went silent. Command relays blinked out. Entire clusters of ships drifted out of formation as their coordination collapsed into chaos. The perfect machine that had been grinding the Zalari into dust was beginning to fracture from the inside. And still, the unknown fleet did not speak. No message came through the open channels. No declaration of intent. No demand. No warning. No claim of authority. Only action. Phelan leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the display as realization slowly took shape in his mind. This was not a rescue in the way he understood it. This was something else. Something older. Something precise. The officer at the sensor station swallowed hard before speaking again. Sir, we're attempting to identify the fleet, but there's no match in any database. No known design patterns. No known energy signatures. It's like they don't exist. Phelan's gaze did not waver. Everything exists, he said quietly. If it's here, it has a reason. Another relay station vanished from the enemy network, followed by a chain reaction of failures that spread through their formation like a silent storm. For the first time since the battle had begun, the enemy ships hesitated. Not out of fear, out of confusion. And in war, confusion was the first step toward defeat. The unknown fleet shifted slightly, tightening their position behind the enemy lines, cutting off any attempt at organized retreat. They were not just attacking. They were controlling the shape of the battle itself, turning the enemy's strength into a weakness. Whoever they were, they understood this battlefield better than anyone who had been fighting in it. Phelan exhaled slowly, the weight of command pressing down on him in a different way now. If this was help, it was unlike any help the Zalari had ever received. If this was an ally, it was one that had chosen to remain silent until the exact moment their presence would matter most. And if this was something else? He pushed the thought aside. Another officer spoke, her voice quieter now, edged with something that had not been there before. Sir, should we attempt communication? Phelan considered the question for a moment. On the screen, another segment of the enemy fleet lost cohesion, their movements turning erratic as their command structure unraveled. The unknown ships continued their work without pause, without acknowledgement, without hesitation. No, he said at last. The officer looked at him, surprised. Sir, Phelan's eyes remained on the battle. They know exactly what they're doing, he said. And they didn't come here to talk. He paused, watching as the impossible unfolded in real time. They came here for a reason. Far beyond the burning world, in the cold dark behind the enemy lines, the silent fleet continued to move. Not like conquerors, not like saviors, but like something that had been waiting, and had finally decided it was time to act. The brief disruption behind the enemy lines did not stop the war. It only made it louder. As the unknown fleet dismantled relay nodes and fractured coordination, the main body of the enemy force responded with overwhelming force. Their command structure adapted quickly, rerouting control through hardened channels and deploying autonomous strike patterns that required no central guidance. What they lost in precision, they replaced with sheer volume. The sky above the Zalari homeworld erupted again. Massive plasma arcs descended in relentless waves, each impact tearing open sections of the failing shield. Entire districts vanished under concentrated bombardment, leaving behind nothing but expanding clouds of ash and ionized debris. The oceans boiled where the strikes were heaviest, sending pillars of vapor into an atmosphere already choked with smoke. Inside the command station, the tactical display shifted from structured formations to a cascade of warning signals. Shield integrity at 7%, the systems officer reported. This time, the steadiness in her voice was gone. We are losing stabilization across all sectors. Manual rerouting is no longer effective. Another voice cut in from the communications array. Evacuation convoys are being intercepted. Enemy patrols have closed the outer corridors. We're receiving distress signals from every sector. Admiral Phelan listened, but the words felt distant. He watched the planet instead. For decades, the Zalari had believed their world was untouchable. Their defenses were layered, their fleets disciplined, their alliances strong. They had prepared for war in every way they understood. But they had not prepared for this. The enemy was not here to conquer territory or negotiate surrender. They were here to erase. Their attacks targeted infrastructure with surgical cruelty, power grids, shield generators, atmospheric stabilizers. each strike chosen to ensure that even survival would be impossible. Civilian casualties are exceeding projections, an analyst said quietly. We are no longer tracking individual zones. Entire regions are gone. Phelan closed his eyes for a brief moment. He did not allow himself the luxury of grief. Not yet. Time to total shield collapse? He asked. 87 minutes, came the reply. Possibly less if the current rate increases. 87 minutes. Even if the unknown fleet continued their disruption, even if they managed to cripple parts of the enemy formation, it would not be enough. The Zalari defenses were already too far gone. The shield would fall, and when it did, the planet would be exposed to direct bombardment. Nothing could survive that. A sudden surge of alarms cut through the command center. New energy signature detected, the sensor officer announced, her voice rising. Central enemy formation is deploying a heavy platform. It's massive. The display zoomed in automatically, focusing on the heart of the enemy fleet. At first, it looked like a distortion in space itself, a region where light bent unnaturally. Then the structure resolved, emerging from the protective screen of surrounding ships. It was larger than any vessel currently in the battle, its surface layered with interlocking armor plates and glowing conduits that pulsed with contained power. Weapon analysis in progress, the officer continued, her hands moving rapidly across the console. We are detecting gravitational fluctuations around the structure. This is not a standard energy weapon. Phelan leaned forward slightly. Effect. There was a pause. Then, we don't know, she admitted. But the energy buildup is extreme. They did not have to wait long to find out. The structure shifted, its core aligning with the planet below. For a moment, everything seemed to hold still, as if the battle itself had paused to watch what would happen next. Then the weapon fired. There was no beam, no flash of light. Instead, the space between the structure and the planet twisted, as if reality itself had been pulled out of shape. The distortion expanded rapidly, rippling outward in a silent wave that reached the Zalari shield in less than a second. The shield did not shatter. It folded. The emerald barrier bent inward under impossible pressure, its surface warping like thin metal under a crushing force. For a brief moment, it held, the entire defensive grid straining against something it had never been designed to resist. Then it collapsed, not in fragments, not in sparks, but in a sudden, total failure that left the planet exposed. Shield is down, someone said, their voice barely audible. The next wave of bombardment followed immediately. Without the shield to absorb the impact, the strikes hit the surface directly. Cities that had survived the earlier phases of the attack were erased in seconds. Shockwaves spread across continents, igniting forests, collapsing mountain ranges, and tearing open the ground itself. The command station trembled as distant impacts registered through the planet's crust. Atmospheric stability is failing, the systems officer reported, panic breaking through now. We are losing pressure across multiple regions. If this continues. She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Phelan looked at the tactical display again, forcing himself to focus on what remained. The unknown fleet was still there. They continued their silent assault on the enemy's structure, dismantling support systems, disrupting formations, cutting off resources. But even they had not anticipated this. The deployment of the gravity-based weapon had changed the nature of the battle entirely. This was no longer a war of fleets. It was an execution. Admiral, the communications officer said, her voice shaking now. We are receiving a priority transmission from the Planetary Council. Phelan nodded once. Put it through. The main screen shifted, replacing the chaos of the battlefield with the image of the council chamber. The figures on the screen were composed, but their expressions carried the weight of what was happening outside. Admiral Phelan, the council leader began, his voice calm despite everything. We have assessed the situation. There was a pause, brief but heavy. We are issuing a full termination order for all remaining evacuation efforts. The words settled into the room like a physical presence. Redirect all remaining resources to civilian shelters and emergency stabilization systems. The leader continued. We will preserve as many lives as possible for as long as possible. Phelan felt something tighten in his chest. This is not a strategic withdrawal, the leader said quietly. This is survival. Around him, the officers in the command center went still. No one argued. No one questioned the order, because they all understood what it meant. They were no longer trying to win. They were trying to endure. The transmission ended, leaving the room in a silence broken only by the constant stream of alerts and damage reports. Phelan turned back to the display. The planet was burning. The enemy fleet remained dominant. And the unknown ships, whatever they were not enough. Not yet. Time to atmospheric failure, he asked, his voice steady again through force of will. Estimated at 60 minutes, came the reply. 60 minutes. An hour between existence and extinction. Phelan watched as another section of the planet went dark, its power grid finally failing under the sustained assault. The fires spread, merging into a single, continuous glow that wrapped around the world like a second, more terrible sun. For the first time since the unknown fleet had appeared, the thought surfaced clearly in his mind. This was still not enough. Whatever help had come, whatever force had chosen this moment to reveal itself, it might already be too late. And yet, far beyond the burning world, behind the enemy lines where no ally had ever stood before, the silent fleet continued its work. Unhindered, unannounced, unstoppable, as if the outcome of this battle had not yet been decided, as if the end had not yet come. Long before the sky burned, before the enemy fleets turned worlds into ash, there had been another day when the Zalari stood on the edge of extinction. It had not looked like war at first. The human colony had been small, distant from the main trade routes, built in a quiet system where the light of its star was steady and forgiving. It was not meant to be important. It was meant to be safe, a place where a fragile species could grow without drawing attention. That illusion had lasted exactly 9 years. The attack came without warning. No declarations, no signals, no chance to negotiate. Unknown ships dropped out of space above the colony and began firing before the orbital defenses could even activate. The first strikes targeted communication arrays and navigation systems, cutting the colony off from the rest of human space in seconds. The second wave erased the defense grid. By the time anyone understood what was happening, it was already over. The sky filled with falling debris. Fragments of stations burned as they tore through the atmosphere. Transport vessels that had tried to escape were caught mid-flight and shattered into pieces that rained down over the colony's surface. The ground shook as impacts spread across the landscape, turning entire districts into fields of fire. Inside one of the emergency shelters, a child sat in the dark, clutching a small metal tag attached to a chain around his neck. He did not understand what was happening outside. He understood noise and light, and the way the walls trembled with every distant impact. He understood the fear in the voices of the adults around him, the hurried instructions, the way no one seemed to have answers anymore. "Stay here," someone had told him. "Do not leave." So he stayed. Hours passed, though time had no meaning in the dim red glow of the shelter. The air grew stale. The emergency lights flickered. At some point, the distant sounds of destruction became less frequent, replaced by a heavy silence that felt even worse. The child listened to that silence and realized something without fully understanding it. No one was coming. The shelter door finally opened not long after. Not with the careful control of someone following procedure, but with a violent force that sent dust and fragments scattering across the floor. Light flooded into the room, harsh and blinding after hours in the dark. Figures stood in the doorway. They were not human. For a moment, no one moved. The adults in the shelter froze, their fear shifting into something sharper, more desperate. They had no weapons, no defenses left to offer. Whatever these beings wanted, there was nothing they could do to stop it. Then one of the figures stepped forward. Its form was unfamiliar, its features shaped by a biology the humans had never seen before, but its movements were careful, measured. It lowered whatever tool it carried, making no sudden gestures, no threatening motions. Behind it, more figures entered, spreading out through the shelter. One of the adults found their voice. "Please," they said, the word breaking as it left them. "We don't have anything left. There's nothing here." The alien raised a hand, not to silence them with force, but with something closer to reassurance. Then it spoke. The language was different, the sounds unfamiliar, but the tone carried meaning even without translation. Calm, steady, not an order, not a threat, an attempt. Moments later, a small device activated on its wrist, projecting a simple translation into the air between them. You are safe, the voice said. The words did not make sense at first. Safe was not something that existed anymore. We are Zalari, the voice continued. We detected your distress. We are here to assist. The adults stared, unable to process what they were hearing. Assist. The word felt unreal. One of the humans stepped forward slowly, disbelief written across his face. You came here? For us. The Zalari figure inclined its head slightly, as if the question itself was unnecessary. Yes. Outside, the colony was still burning. Smoke filled the sky, turning the light of the sun into a dull, reddish glow. The attackers had already begun to withdraw, their objective complete. What they left behind was not a battlefield, but a grave. And yet, through that ruin, ships descended. Zalari vessels, sleek and luminous against the darkened sky, moved with purpose as they scanned for survivors. Transport bays opened, and rescue teams spread across the surface, searching through debris, cutting into collapsed structures, pulling the living from beneath the dead. They did not hesitate. They did not ask what they would gain. They simply acted. The child was carried out of the shelter in the arms of one of the Zalari. He remembered the brightness of the outside world after so long in the dark. He remembered the smell of smoke, the heat of distant fires, the way the ground still felt unstable beneath each step. Most of all, he remembered looking up. The sky, once clear and open, was filled with ships he did not recognize. Ships that had come from somewhere else, from people who did not know him, who had no reason to care whether he lived or died. And yet they were there. He tightened his grip on the small metal tag around his neck, as if holding onto the only piece of his old life that remained. Where are we going? He asked, his voice small against the vastness of everything around him. The Zalari carrying him adjusted its hold slightly, careful not to cause discomfort. To safety, it replied through the translator. The words sounded different this time. Not empty, not impossible, real. The evacuation took hours, then days. Every survivor that could be found was brought aboard the Zalari ships. The wounded were treated without question, without distinction. Supplies were shared freely. Space was made where there had been none. Entire sections of Zalari vessels were reconfigured to accommodate the influx of refugees. No one was turned away. When the last of the rescue operations concluded, the Zalari fleet did not leave immediately. They remained in orbit, monitoring the system, ensuring that no further threats emerged, that no survivors had been missed. Only when they were certain that nothing more could be done did they begin the journey back to their own space. The humans did not know what to expect. They had lost everything. Their homes, their infrastructure, their connection to the rest of their species. They were no longer a colony. They were remnants. They expected conditions, agreements, demands. They expected a cost. Instead, when they arrived, they were given something else. Shelter. The Zalari opened their worlds to them. Cities that had never been designed for humans were adapted with quiet efficiency. New habitats were constructed. Food supplies were shared. Medical care was provided without hesitation. The survivors were not treated as burdens or as temporary guests to be managed until they could leave. They were treated as people, as lives worth preserving. Time passed. The child grew older. He learned the language of the Zalari, learned their customs, their ways of thinking. He learned how close they had come to stretching their own resources beyond safe limits just to ensure that the humans could survive. He also learned something else. They never once asked for anything in return. Years later, when the first human-led structures began to form again, when the survivors had gathered enough strength to think about a future beyond simple survival, a delegation was sent to speak with the Zalari leadership. The child, no longer a child, stood among them. He had carried the memory of that day with him through every step of his life. The burning sky, the broken world, the moment when everything had ended and then, somehow, had not. He watched as one of the human representatives stepped forward. "We owe you everything," the man said, his voice steady but heavy with meaning. "Without you, we would not exist. There is no way to repay what you have done for us, but we will try. Tell us what you need. Tell us how we can return this." The Zalari leader listened without interruption. When the human finished, the chamber fell quiet. For a moment, it seemed as if the answer might be complicated, that there would be terms, expectations, some structure to balance what had been given. Instead, the leader smiled. It was a small expression, subtle, but unmistakable. You do not owe us everything, the Zalari said gently. We did what was right. The human shook his head. That does not make the debt disappear. The Zalari considered that for a moment. Then it gave an answer that none of them expected. Then remember us, it said. The words were simple, almost too simple. When you are strong, the Zalari continued, remember that you were not alone. The chamber remained silent. No conditions, no contracts, no demands, just a request. Remember, the man who had once been the child stood there, the small metal tag still hanging from his neck, worn now with age, but no less important. He understood something in that moment that would stay with him for the rest of his life. This was not a transaction. It was trust. And trust, once given, did not fade. It waited. Years later, as he stood on the command deck of a ship that did not exist in any known registry, watching a distant world burn under enemy fire, that memory remained as clear as it had been on the day it was made. The promise had never been written down. It had never needed to be, because some debts were not recorded in systems or ledgers. They were carried, and humanity had never forgotten how to carry them. For most of the galaxy, humanity was a story that had already ended. It had not happened all at once. There was no single event that marked their disappearance, no final battle or recorded extinction. Instead, they simply faded. Their signals grew less frequent, their trade routes went quiet, and the scattered systems they had once occupied were gradually abandoned or left to drift without contact. At first, it was assumed to be temporary. The survivors of the old colony, those who had been taken in by the Zalari, had begun rebuilding slowly. There were reports of new settlements, small industrial outposts, and early attempts at restoring interstellar capability. Other species expected them to return to the wider stage eventually, to reclaim what they had lost. But they never did. Years passed, then decades. The few human ships that ventured beyond their immediate space became rarer, then vanished entirely. Attempts to locate their new colonies failed. Signals that had once marked their presence went silent, one by one, until there was nothing left to track. Eventually, the assumption changed. Humanity had not withdrawn. Humanity had died. The official records reflected that conclusion. Historical archives listed them among the many species that had risen briefly, struggled against a hostile galaxy, and ultimately failed to survive it. Their name became a footnote, a minor entry in a long catalog of lost civilizations. But the galaxy did not fully agree with its own records. Stories persisted. At first, they were dismissed as misunderstandings or exaggerations. Isolated reports from fringe systems, usually from traders or independent crews who had spent too long in deep space. They spoke of ships that did not match any known design, vessels that appeared without warning and vanished just as quickly, leaving behind no trace except confusion. Most of those stories contradicted each other. Some described massive warships that moved without detectable propulsion, their hulls absorbing light until they looked like moving shadows. Others claimed the ships were small, almost insignificant, but impossibly fast, capable of slipping through sensor nets without triggering a single alert. There were accounts of entire pirate fleets being dismantled in minutes, their command structures collapsing before they could even identify what was attacking them. Survivors spoke of systems going dark, of weapons failing without explanation, of ships drifting helplessly as if something had reached inside their machines and turned them off. No one could confirm any of it. No wreckage was ever recovered. No clear recordings survived. And most importantly, no one could identify who, or what, was responsible. The story should have faded. Instead, they spread, not through official channels, but through quiet conversations in docking bays, through encrypted messages shared between captains, through warnings passed along routes that avoided the attention of larger powers. Stay out of that sector. Something's out there. It doesn't like being found. Over time, a pattern began to form. The incidents, scattered as they were, all shared one common detail. They occurred in places where no major power held control. Unclaimed systems, forgotten routes, regions of space that had been written off as empty or unimportant. Places where something could exist without being seen. Theories emerged, most of them quickly dismissed. Some believed it was a new faction, a hidden empire building strength in isolation. Others suggested it was an automated defense network left behind by a long-dead civilization, still carrying out its directives without understanding them. A few, usually those who had spent the most time listening to the stories rather than dismissing them, considered a different possibility: that humanity had never gone extinct, that they had chosen to disappear. The idea was not taken seriously in official circles. It did not fit the data. It did not align with known patterns of species behavior. No civilization willingly erased itself from the galaxy without leaving some form of trace, some attempt to maintain influence or presence. And yet, the absence itself became a kind of evidence. Because if humanity had truly collapsed, there would have been remnants. Abandoned fleets, degraded signals, decaying infrastructure left behind to be discovered and catalogued. There was nothing. It was as if they had not died, but stepped away. The Zalari did not participate in those discussions. They did not correct the records. They did not confirm the rumors. They did not offer explanations when asked directly about the fate of the humans they had once sheltered. Their official position remained simple: humanity is not part of current galactic affairs. It was a statement that revealed nothing. But among the Zalari themselves, the memory remained intact. They remembered the years after the rescue, when the humans had begun to rebuild. They remembered the way those survivors had approached the future, not with desperation, but with a kind of quiet determination that did not match the scale of their losses. They had expected the humans to reintegrate, to form alliances, to seek protection within the larger structures of the galaxy. Instead, the humans had done something else. They had left, not suddenly, not in secret, but with a deliberate withdrawal that raised more questions than it answered. They closed their networks, dismantled their outward-facing infrastructure, and redirected their efforts inward. At the time, it had seemed like caution, a species that had been nearly destroyed, choosing to avoid further risk. But as the years turned into decades, and the decades into centuries, that explanation began to feel incomplete. Because the humans had not simply hidden. They had continued to grow. The Zalari could not see it directly. The humans had ensured that. But there were signs, subtle and difficult to trace, that suggested ongoing development. Materials that appeared in trade networks without a clear origin. Technologies that bore unfamiliar design principles. Isolated incidents where systems functioned in ways that no known engineering approach could explain. Each piece was small. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Something was happening in the dark. Something deliberate. The galaxy, for the most part, chose not to look too closely. There were always larger concerns. Conflicts between established powers, shifting alliances, emerging threats that demanded immediate attention. The absence of humanity was a settled matter, a closed chapter that did not require further investigation. It was easier that way. Easier to believe that one more species had been lost than to consider that it might still be out there, unseen and unaccounted for. Easier to move forward without questioning what might be waiting beyond the edges of known space. And so the records remained unchanged. Humanity, extinct. The stories, however, did not disappear. They grew quieter, more refined, passed only between those who had reason to take them seriously. Among independent captains, deep space engineers, and those who operated far from the controlled environments of major systems, a different understanding began to take shape. Not a confirmed truth, but a possibility that somewhere beyond the mapped regions, beyond the trade routes and monitored corridors, there was a civilization that had chosen to step away from the galaxy. A civilization that had not forgotten how to build, or fight, or survive. A civilization that had been given a chance to live when it should have died, and had spent centuries deciding what to do with that chance. No one could prove it. No one could point to a specific system or location and say with certainty, they are there. But the idea persisted, because it explained too much. It explained the sudden disappearances, the silent interventions, the events that left no trace but changed everything for those who experienced them. It explained the absence. And now, as an unknown fleet moved through the heart of a battle no one else had been able to turn, dismantling an enemy force from the inside with precision that bordered on impossible, that idea began to feel less like speculation and more like truth. Far from the burning world, in the space behind the enemy lines where no known force had ever positioned itself without detection, the silent ships continued their advance. They did not broadcast their presence. They did not claim their actions. They did not announce who they were, but in the way they moved, in the way they fought, in the way they chose their targets with deliberate, practiced certainty, there was something unmistakable. Not to the galaxy, not yet, but to those who remembered, to those who had once opened their doors to a broken species and asked for nothing in return. The legend had never truly vanished. It had only been waiting. And now, for the first time in centuries, it was beginning to take shape again in the light. The command chamber aboard the lead human vessel was silent, but it was not the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of people who already understood what the answer would cost. Commander Vance stood at the center of the room, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the tactical console. Around him, the senior officers watched the shifting display of the battlefield, streams of data flowing across the surface, tracking enemy movements, Zalari losses, and the narrowing window of time that remained. No one spoke immediately. They did not need a report to understand the situation. They had been observing it from the moment the first Zalari distress signal broke through the deep space listening arrays. They had tracked the enemy's advance, analyzed their tactics, predicted the outcome with cold accuracy. The conclusion had not changed. Without intervention, the Zalari would be erased. "We have disrupted 23% of their command structure," one of the officers said finally, her voice controlled but heavy with meaning. "Their coordination is degraded, but not enough to stop the main assault. The gravity platform is still active. If it fires again at full capacity, the planetary crust will destabilize." Vance nodded once, his gaze fixed on the display. "How long?" he asked. 43 minutes until full atmospheric failure," she replied. "Less than an hour." The room absorbed that number in silence. Another officer stepped forward, his expression tight with restraint. "We are already operating beyond initial engagement parameters. If we escalate further, we risk exposure." That word carried weight. Exposure meant more than being seen. It meant the end of 3 centuries of deliberate absence. It meant revealing their existence not just to the enemy, but to the entire galaxy. Every power, every opportunist, every species that had grown used to a universe without humanity would suddenly have to account for their return. And they would react. "Enemy long-range sensors are beginning to adjust," the officer continued. "It's only a matter of time before they realize what they're dealing with. If we commit fully, there will be no way to maintain concealment." Another voice joined in, quieter but no less firm. "We are not prepared for open conflict on a galactic scale. Our infrastructure is still distributed, our positions still hidden. If we reveal everything now, we risk losing the advantage we've spent centuries building." The arguments were not emotional. They were logical, carefully considered. Correct. Vance listened to each of them without interruption. He had heard these points before. They had been part of every long-term projection, every strategic discussion about what would happen if humanity was forced to act before it was ready. This was that moment. On the display, another section of the Zalari surface went dark. A chain of impacts rippled across a continent, the heat signatures merging into a single expanding scar that consumed everything in its path. The gravity weapon fired again, its distortion tearing through what remained of the upper atmosphere, sending shockwaves that destabilized entire regions. 43 minutes became less. "Commander," the first officer said, more quietly now, "if we limit our engagement to disruption, we can withdraw with minimal trace. The enemy will be weakened, the Zalari may gain time, and we remain unseen." Unseen. The word echoed faintly in the room. It had defined them for generations. They had built their fleets in silence, hidden within dead systems and hollowed asteroids. They had trained in environments where no signal escaped, where every movement was contained, controlled, unobserved. They had learned to exist without recognition, to grow without attracting attention. It had kept them alive. It had given them strength. It had given them time. Vance looked at the display again, at the burning world, at the collapsing defenses, at the steadily decreasing number that marked how long the Zalari had left. Then, without turning, he spoke. "When the colony fell," he said quietly, "how long did it take for the Zalari to respond?" The question caught the room off guard. A few of the officers exchanged brief glances before one of them answered. "Based on historical records, less than 6 hours from initial distress signal to arrival. They crossed active conflict zones," another added. "Entered an unsecured system. engaged unknown hostile forces without prior intelligence. They had no strategic advantage, Vance continued. No, the officer confirmed. They didn't. They had no guarantee of survival. No, they had no reason to believe they would gain anything from it. The room remained silent. Vance finally turned, his gaze moving across the faces of the people around him. They came anyway, he said. There was no accusation in his voice. No anger. Only fact. They did not ask if it was safe, he continued. They did not calculate the long-term consequences. They saw a species on the edge of extinction, and they acted. The officer who had spoken earlier straightened slightly. Commander, with respect, the situation is not the same. We are no longer a failing colony. We are alive, Vance finished. The words settled into the space between them. We are alive, he repeated, because they chose to act when it was not safe. No one argued that. They could not. Vance stepped closer to the central console, the light from the display reflecting faintly in his eyes. For 300 years, he said, we have prepared for this moment. He gestured toward the battle. Not this specific war. Not this specific enemy. But this choice. The officers listened, the weight of his words building with each sentence. We told ourselves we were waiting until we were strong enough, Vance continued. That we needed time. That we needed to be ready for whatever the galaxy might become. He paused briefly. We are ready. The statement was not loud. It did not need to be. One of the officers shook his head slightly. Even if that's true, full engagement means more than winning this battle. It means announcing ourselves to every major power within range. It means becoming a target again. Vance met his gaze. Yes, he said. The simplicity of the answer left no room for reinterpretation. Another officer spoke, more cautiously. And if we are not strong enough? If this draws attention we cannot handle? Vance considered that for a moment. Then he answered with the same calm certainty. Then we adapt, he said. Like we always have. The room fell quiet again. On the display, the Zalari planet continued to burn. The number marking atmospheric stability dropped further. 38 minutes. Vance placed his hand flat against the console, the cold surface grounding him for a brief moment. They asked for nothing, he said. The words were softer now, more personal. They gave us shelter, time, a future. He looked back at the officers. And when we asked how to repay that, they gave us an answer. Several of them already knew what he was going to say. They had studied the records. They had grown up with the story. Remember us, Vance said. The room held still. That was all they asked, he continued. Not resources. Not allegiance. Not repayment. He let the silence linger for a moment. Just that we remember. On the display, another Zalari vessel was destroyed, its signal cutting out abruptly as it was consumed by enemy fire. The number dropped again. 34 minutes. Vance straightened. We have remembered, he said. The tone of his voice changed slightly. Not louder, but firmer. And now they are calling. No one spoke. No one needed to. Because the argument was no longer strategic. It was not about risk assessment or long-term positioning. It was about identity. About what kind of species they had become after 3 centuries of survival. Vance looked at each of them in turn. We did not spend 300 years hiding so we could survive forever, he said. We did it so we would be strong enough to choose what matters. He turned back to the display one final time. The burning world. The collapsing defenses. The narrowing window. Then he gave the order. End concealment protocols. The words moved through the room like a shift in gravity. Every officer understood what they meant. Every system that had been designed to hide them, to mask their presence, to ensure that they remained invisible to the wider galaxy, would be disabled. They would no longer be ghosts. They would be seen. Full fleet activation, Vance continued. All units, all systems. We commit completely. The hesitation that had filled the room moments before was gone. In its place was something else. Not relief. Not excitement. Clarity. Commands began to flow immediately, precise and efficient. Disengaging signature dampeners. Powering primary systems to full output. Opening fleet-wide communication channels. Targeting solutions updating in real time. The ship itself seemed to respond, a low vibration running through its structure as systems that had remained suppressed for centuries came fully online. Vance remained at the console, watching as the status indicators shifted. Green. Across the board. Ready. He took a slow breath. Then he spoke again, this time into the open channel that connected every ship in the fleet. "This is Commander Vance," he said, his voice carrying across distances that no signal should have been able to cross undetected. "For 3 centuries, we have remained in the dark." He paused, just long enough for every listener to focus. "We are done waiting." On the display, the fleet's status updated as 1. No longer hidden, no longer silent, no longer unknown. "We are not here to announce ourselves," Vance continued. "We are here to finish what was started." He looked at the burning world one last time. "The Zalari gave us a future," he said. Now his voice carried something more than calm. It carried resolve. "Today, we give them one." The channel closed, and in the space behind the enemy lines, the fleet that had not existed for 300 years prepared to step fully into the light. For a fraction of a second, nothing changed. The enemy fleet continued its assault. The gravity platform adjusted for another strike. The Zalari defenses struggled to hold together under pressure that had already surpassed their limits. To any observer watching the battlefield from a distance, the outcome still appeared inevitable. Then the silence behind the enemy lines ended. It did not begin with a sound. It began with absence. Entire sections of space that had been invisible moments before suddenly resolved into something solid, something vast. The darkness itself seemed to sharpen, taking form as the human fleet dropped every remaining layer of concealment at once. Sensors across the battlefield reacted too late. By the time the enemy systems registered the surge of energy, the change had already happened. The void behind them was no longer empty. Hundreds of ships emerged in perfect formation, their hulls no longer absorbing light, but reflecting it in cold, metallic edges that cut through the darkness. Engines ignited not with chaotic bursts of energy, but with controlled precision, emitting a deep blue glow that spread outward like a wave. For the first time in centuries, humanity was visible, and they were already in position. "Enemy sensors are spiking," one of Vance's officers reported. "They're attempting to reorient. Too late. We are inside their outer defense grid." Vance did not respond. He watched the tactical display as the entire enemy formation struggled to adapt to a threat that had appeared where no threat should have been possible. "Begin Phase 1, he said. The order moved through the fleet instantly. There was no countdown, no hesitation. The attack began with precision. Not explosions, not chaos. Control. At the center of the enemy formation, the remaining communication relays flickered once and died. Across multiple sectors, targeting systems failed simultaneously. Ships that had been firing in coordinated patterns suddenly lost synchronization, their weapons discharging at empty space or failing to fire at all. Navigation systems glitched, feeding false positional data that caused formations to drift out of alignment. Confusion spread faster than any weapon. "What are they doing?" an enemy commander demanded over an open channel, his voice distorted by interference. "Re-establish formation." The transmission cut off abruptly. Human electronic warfare systems had already moved deeper. They did not simply jam signals. They replaced them. Enemy displays filled with false readings. Ghost fleets where there were none. Empty space where human ships already advanced. Target locks shifted unpredictably, guiding weapons away from real threats and toward harmless debris. Within seconds, the enemy's greatest strength, its coordination, collapsed. "Phase 2, Vance said. This time, the response was visible. Human ships surged forward in controlled bursts, their movement synchronized to a level that bordered on mechanical perfection. They did not spread out randomly or charge directly into the heaviest defenses. They moved in layered formations, each unit occupying a precise position within a larger structure that adapted in real time. The first strikes hit the enemy's supply lines. Kinetic projectiles, accelerated to extreme velocities, tore through fuel carriers and resource transports before defensive systems could react. The impacts were clean, efficient, and devastating. One by one, the ships that sustained the enemy's advance were reduced to drifting wreckage. Secondary strikes followed immediately. Missile systems launched in coordinated waves, each projectile adjusting its trajectory mid-flight to avoid interception. They did not target heavily armored warships. They targeted the systems those ships relied on: external weapon mounts, shield emitters, engine arrays. The enemy fleet began to fragment. "What is this formation?" another enemy voice demanded, panic breaking through discipline. They're not engaging directly, they're. The channel dissolved into static. On the Zalari side of the battlefield, the change was immediate. The pressure that had been crushing their defenses began to ease. Enemy fire, once precise and overwhelming, became erratic. Entire attack patterns broke apart as coordination failed. Ships that had been moments away from destruction found themselves suddenly unopposed, their attackers either disabled or redirected. Admiral Thalen stared at the display, trying to understand what he was seeing. The unknown fleet had changed. They were no longer shadows. They were a force, and they were dismantling the enemy with a level of control that made the battle look deliberate, not desperate, not reactive, planned. "Admiral," one of his officers said, his voice tight with disbelief. "We are receiving targeting data from the unknown fleet." Thalen turned sharply. "Explain." "They're marking enemy weak points," the officer continued. "Fuel reserves, damaged shield segments, exposed weapon systems. It's precise. Extremely precise." The data streamed across the Zalari systems, integrating seamlessly as if it had always been part of their network. "They're guiding us," the officer said quietly. For a moment, Thalen did not respond. Then he gave the order. "Redirect all remaining firepower to designated targets," he said. "Follow their lead." Across the battlefield, Zalari ships adjusted their positions, aligning with the new data. Their weakened fleets, moments away from collapse, found structure again. Their attacks, once scattered and ineffective, began to land with renewed accuracy. The tide shifted, not gradually, decisively. "Phase 3, Vance said. The human fleet responded with its final escalation. From beneath the hulls of the larger ships, deployment bays opened. Drone swarms launched in coordinated waves, thousands of small, fast-moving units spreading outward in controlled patterns. They did not fly in straight lines. They moved like living systems, adjusting their paths continuously, avoiding fire, converging on targets from multiple angles at once. Enemy defenses struggled to track them. Turrets fired wildly, attempting to intercept threats that changed direction faster than targeting systems could compensate. Point defense grids overloaded, prioritizing some targets while others slipped through unnoticed. The drones reached their objectives. They attached themselves to enemy hulls, clustering around critical structural points. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then the charges detonated, not with massive explosions, but with focused precision. Armor plates were peeled away. Internal systems were exposed. Shield generators failed in cascading sequences that left entire sections of ships vulnerable. Human capital ships moved in immediately. Railgun batteries fired in synchronized bursts, each shot calculated to exploit the newly exposed weaknesses. Massive enemy vessels, once considered nearly indestructible, began to break apart under targeted strikes that left no room for recovery. "Enemy command is attempting to regroup," an officer reported. "They're pulling reserves toward the center." Vance watched the movement on the display. "They're too late," he said. The enemy fleet, built on coordination and overwhelming force, had lost both. Their formations were scattered, their supply lines destroyed, their command structure fragmented. What remained was not an organized army. It was a collection of ships trying to survive. On the Zalari side, the transformation was just as dramatic. Ships that had been retreating turned back into the fight. Defensive lines stabilized, then advanced. For the first time since the battle began, Zalari forces were not reacting. They were pushing forward. Admiral Thalen stood in silence as the impossible became reality. The unknown fleet had not just intervened. They had taken control of the battle. "Admiral," the communications officer said, her voice steadier now. "The enemy is broadcasting wide-channel signals. They're demanding identification." Thalen looked at the display, at the ships that had appeared from nothing and rewritten the outcome of a war in minutes. "Do we respond?" she asked. Thalen considered the question. Then he shook his head slightly. "No," he said, "because whatever those ships were, they had not come here to announce themselves. They had come here to finish something." And as the human fleet continued its precise, relentless advance through the collapsing enemy formation, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was not a desperate rescue. This was a return. And the galaxy, whether it understood it or not, was witnessing the moment a forgotten species stepped back into the light, stronger, sharper, and far more dangerous than anyone had ever imagined. For a brief moment, it looked like the battle was already won. The enemy formation had fractured. Their supply lines were gone. Their coordination, once their greatest strength, had dissolved into scattered, isolated commands that contradicted each other. Zolari ships advanced for the first time since the invasion began, reclaiming space that had seemed permanently lost. But the enemy was not finished. They adapted. At the center of the battlefield, where the largest concentration of their remaining forces had gathered, the massive structure that housed the gravity weapon shifted again. Its outer layers opened, revealing deeper systems that had not been active before. Energy surged through its core, brighter and more unstable than anything it had displayed earlier. "Commander," one of Vance's officers said, tension cutting through her voice. "The gravity platform is reconfiguring. Power levels are exceeding previous thresholds." Vance's eyes moved to the display. "What's different?" he asked. The answer came quickly. "It's no longer targeting the planet," she said. "It's targeting us." The realization settled into the room with immediate weight. The weapon had not been designed only for planetary destruction. It was being recalibrated for fleet annihilation. Across the battlefield, space began to distort again, but this time, the effect was wider, less focused. The distortion expanded outward in a growing field, bending light, warping trajectories, and pulling at the very structure of nearby objects. Human ships closest to the center felt it first. Gravitational pressure increasing, a pilot reported over the fleet channel. "Hull integrity holding, barely. We cannot maintain position if this continues." On the display, several ships were already struggling. Their formations wavered as the invisible force pulled at them from multiple directions at once. Thrusters fired at maximum output, but the distortion interfered with even the most precise calculations. "Impact projection?" Vance asked. The tactical officer did not hesitate. "If the field expands at current rate, we lose forward formations in under 3 minutes, she said. 5 minutes, and the entire fleet is within range. 5 minutes. After everything they had done, everything they had rebuilt, everything they had just revealed to the galaxy, they could still be erased here. Enemy reserves are regrouping around the platform," another officer added. "They're forming a defensive perimeter. They know it's their last advantage." Vance studied the display in silence. The battle had shifted again. Their precision had broken the enemy's structure, but now the enemy had responded with overwhelming force, unfocused, unstable, but powerful enough to end everything if left unchecked. "We cannot outmaneuver that field," the pilot said. "It's too wide, too strong." Vance nodded slightly. "I know." His gaze fixed on the center of the enemy formation. On the gravity platform, the source. "If it stays active," the tactical officer said quietly, "we lose." No one disagreed. Vance exhaled slowly. "Then we remove it," he said. The room stilled. "That structure is heavily shielded," one of the officers replied. "Our current weapons are not penetrating its core systems. We've already tried targeted strikes." Vance nodded. "I'm aware." He tapped the display once, isolating the platform and expanding its internal structure. "There is a gap," he said. The officers leaned in slightly, following the projection. "A maintenance corridor," the tactical officer realized. "Minimal shielding. It leads directly to the central control core." "It's too small for a ship," another officer added. "Even our drones would struggle to navigate it under active defense." Vance did not look away from the display. "We don't send ships," he said. The meaning settled in immediately. "A boarding operation. Into the center of an active enemy superweapon." One of the officers shook his head. "Commander, the probability of success is not relevant," Vance said calmly. He turned to face them. "The probability of failure if we do nothing is 100%. No one spoke. Because again, he was right. Vance reached for the command interface. "Prepare a strike team," he said. "Minimal personnel. Maximum efficiency. Engineers and combat specialists." "You're assigning someone else to lead it?" the tactical officer asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Vance met her gaze. "No," he said. The word landed with finality. "I'll lead it." A brief silence followed. "Commander," one of the officers began, "you are the central command node for this operation. If you're lost, then the fleet continues," Vance interrupted. There was no hesitation in his voice. "That is why we built it this way." He stepped away from the console. Assigned secondary command authority, he continued. You have control if I do not return. The officer hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Yes, sir. Around them, the ship continued to vibrate under the growing strain of the gravity field. Time was running out. Vance moved toward the exit, his steps steady, unhurried. Commander, the tactical officer called after him. He paused. Good luck, she said. Vance considered the words for a moment. Then he gave a slight shake of his head. We don't need luck, he replied. And then he was gone. The boarding shuttle detached from the main ship without fanfare. 3 vessels, small and fast, slipped into the expanding chaos of the battlefield. They moved low along the debris field, using broken fragments of destroyed ships as cover. Around them, space twisted under the influence of the gravity weapon, pulling trajectories off course and distorting sensor readings. Inside the lead shuttle, Vance checked his equipment with practiced efficiency. Magnetic boots, reinforced armor, compact rail weapon, breach charges. Nothing unnecessary. Across from him, the rest of the strike team sat in silence. They were not all soldiers. One was an engineer responsible for systems integration. Another specialized in structural analysis. A third carried the tools needed to interface with alien technology under combat conditions. They were here because they understood how things worked and how to break them. Approach vector holding, the pilot reported. We have a window, narrow. Take it, Vance said. The shuttle surged forward. Enemy point defense systems reacted instantly, beams of energy cutting through space as automated turrets attempted to intercept the incoming targets. The shuttles weaved through the fire, their movement erratic by design, adjusting constantly to avoid predictable patterns. One of the trailing vessels took a hit. It did not explode, but its trajectory faltered, spinning briefly before stabilizing. We're still in this, the pilot muttered. Stay on course, Vance replied. The gravity platform loomed ahead, its massive structure dominating the field. Energy surged across its surface, arcs of distortion flickering along its outer layers as it prepared another wave. 30 seconds, the pilot said. Prepare for impact, Vance ordered. The shuttle angled sharply, aligning with the narrow corridor identified in the tactical analysis. The final approach was almost vertical. Then, impact. Magnetic clamps locked onto the surface with a heavy jolt that reverberated through the hull. We're attached, the pilot confirmed. Go, Vance said. The hatch blew open. They moved immediately. Inside the platform, the environment was hostile. The air was dense, heavy with unfamiliar particles. The lighting was dim, pulsing in irregular patterns that made distance difficult to judge. The structure itself vibrated under the strain of its own power, a constant low-frequency hum that could be felt through the floor. Path is this way, the engineer said, already moving. They advanced quickly, boots striking metal with controlled force. The first resistance came within seconds. Enemy units appeared at the far end of the corridor, their armor reflecting the same harsh light that filled the chamber. Weapons raised, they fired without hesitation. Vance returned fire instantly. Short, controlled bursts. Precise. The first 2 targets dropped before they could adjust. The rest pushed forward. Keep moving, Vance said. They did. The corridor twisted, narrowing as they moved deeper. Doors sealed automatically ahead of them, forcing the team to breach each one under pressure. Sparks flew as tools cut through reinforced barriers, the sound of distant impacts echoing through the structure as the battle outside continued. We're close, the engineer said. Core should be just ahead. Another explosion shook the corridor, this time from behind. One of the team staggered, caught in the shockwave. He fell, armor cracked along one side. A medic dropped to his side immediately. He's still breathing, she said, her voice tight. The injured man looked up, forcing a faint, strained expression. Go, he said. Vance did not hesitate. He nodded once and moved forward. The rest followed. The core chamber opened before them. It was vast. At its center, a sphere of condensed energy pulsed with violent intensity, held in place by a network of conduits that fed into it from every direction. The air itself seemed unstable, bending slightly around the core as if space was struggling to hold its shape. This is it, the engineer said. No time for analysis, Vance replied. We know what to do. Charges were placed immediately. Precise locations. Structural supports. Power conduits. every point chosen to ensure maximum destabilization. Sequence ready, the engineers said. But we need manual activation. Remote signal won't penetrate this shielding. Vance stepped toward the console. I'll handle it. The rest of the team finished setting the charges. Everything is in place, one of them said. Then move, Vance ordered. They hesitated, just for a second, because they understood what that meant. You won't make it out in time, the medic said. Vance looked at her. For a moment, the noise of the battle seemed distant. We didn't come here to make it out, he said. He reached into his armor and pulled out a small object. A worn metal tag. He placed it on the console beside the activation interface. A quiet reminder. A promise. Go, he said again. This time, they obeyed. The chamber emptied. Vance stood alone. The core pulsed brighter. The gravity field intensified. He placed his hand on the activation control. Outside, the fleet held the line. Ships strained under the pressure. Formations bending but not breaking as they bought time. Seconds that were measured not in numbers, but in survival. Inside, Vance did not hesitate. He activated the sequence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the core destabilized. The energy within it surged beyond containment, the carefully balanced system collapsing under the deliberate damage inflicted from within. The sphere flickered, its surface fracturing into patterns that could not exist under stable conditions. Alarm screamed. The structure around him began to tear itself apart. Vance remained where he was. The light grew brighter. The distortion intensified. And in that final moment, as the weapon that could have destroyed everything turned against itself, he did not think about survival. He thought about a promise. Then the core collapsed, and the heart of the enemy's power broke with it. The gravity field vanished. Not gradually, not in fading waves, but in a single, violent release, as if the force that had been crushing the battlefield simply let go. Space snapped back into place with a shock that rippled through every ship, every fragment of debris, every sensor system still struggling to process what had just happened. At the center of the enemy formation, the platform split apart. The massive structure that had held the weapon together fractured along its core, the internal collapse tearing through its systems faster than any external attack could have achieved. Sections of it broke away, drifting in slow, burning arcs as the remaining energy inside detonated in contained bursts. Then the chain reaction reached critical. The entire platform imploded. Not outward, inward. Its own power folding against itself, crushing the structure into a collapsing mass of light and debris that vanished into a brief, blinding singularity before releasing a final shockwave across the battlefield. Every ship felt it. Human, Zalari, enemy. For a moment, everything went still. Then the consequences followed. Gravity distortions are gone. One of the officers reported aboard the human fleet, her voice steady but edged with disbelief. All systems stabilizing. On the Zalari side, Admiral Thalen gripped the edge of his command console, staring at the display as the impossible registered fully. The weapon was gone. The force that had broken their world was no longer there. Enemy formation is collapsing, another officer said. They've lost central command. No coordinated response. And just like that, the battle ended. Not with a final clash, not with a drawn-out retreat, but with fragmentation. Enemy ships, once part of a unified and overwhelming force, began to scatter. Some attempted to flee, breaking away from the battlefield in desperate attempts to escape. Others drifted without direction, their systems damaged beyond recovery. A few powered down entirely, their crews choosing surrender over annihilation. They were no longer an army. They were survivors. Maintain pressure, the acting human commander ordered over the fleet channel. Disable fleeing vessels. Do not pursue beyond operational range. There was no anger in the command. No vengeance. Only control. Human ships adjusted immediately, shifting from full assault to containment. Weapons fire became precise again, targeted at engines and critical systems rather than total destruction. The objective was no longer to win. It was to end. And within minutes, it was over. The sky cleared. Where there had once been a wall of fire and destruction, there was now open space, scarred, filled with drifting wreckage, but quiet. The constant barrage of energy that had lit the battlefield was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt almost unreal after everything that had come before. On the surface of the Zalari homeworld, the fires continued to burn. But they were no longer spreading. They were no longer being fed by an unstoppable assault. For the first time in hours, the planet had a chance to survive. In the aftermath, the silence carried weight. Human ships held their positions, maintaining formation without advancing further. Zalari vessels, battered and damaged, drifted closer together, their movements cautious as if they were still expecting the attack to resume at any moment. It didn't. "Admiral," the communications officer said quietly, "we are receiving a direct channel request from the unknown fleet." Thalen looked at the display. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he nodded. "Open it." The main screen shifted. The image that appeared was clear, unfiltered. A human, older than most soldiers Thalen had seen, his features marked not by age alone, but by experience. His uniform carried no insignia that matched any known military structure, but there was no doubt about what he was. "Command, this is Admiral Thalen of the Zalari Defense," he said, his voice steady despite everything. "Identify yourself." The human regarded him calmly. "This is acting command of the Terran fleet," he replied. "Commander Vance is unavailable." There was a brief pause. Thalen understood what that meant without needing further explanation. He inclined his head slightly. "Then you have our gratitude," he said. "You have done more than we could have asked for. You have saved our world." The human's expression did not change. "We are not here for gratitude," he said. The words were not cold. They were certain. Thalen studied him for a moment. "Then why are you here?" he asked. The human did not hesitate. 300 years ago," he said, "your people answered a distress signal." The memory settled into the space between them immediately. "You entered a system that was already lost," the human continued. "You took in survivors who had nothing left. You gave them shelter, resources, and time." Thalen felt something shift, something deeper than simple recognition. "You asked for nothing in return," the human said. The channel remained silent except for his voice. "But you did ask for one thing." Thalen already knew the words before they were spoken. "Remember us." The human nodded once. "We did." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The battlefield, still filled with the remnants of destruction, felt distant compared to the weight of that simple exchange. "We are not here to claim territory," the human continued. "We are not here to establish control. We are not here to change your government or your borders." Each statement was deliberate, clear. "We are here to repay a debt." Thalen exhaled slowly. "And now," he asked. The human's gaze did not waver. "Now the debt is settled." The simplicity of it carried more weight than any formal agreement. Thalen considered his next words carefully. "You have revealed yourselves to the galaxy," he said. "That will have consequences. Powers will respond. Questions will be asked." "Yes," the human replied. There was no concern in his voice. No hesitation. "We are prepared for that." Thalen studied him for a moment longer. "Then let us stand with you," he said. "You have earned that much. An alliance. Shared defense. Whatever you require." The offer was genuine. It carried the weight of everything that had just happened. The human listened. Then he shook his head slightly. "No," he said. Thalen frowned faintly. "No. We did not come here to gain allies," the human said. "We came here because you were ours." The words were simple, but they carried something deeper. Not ownership. Not obligation. Connection. "You gave us a future when we had none," the human continued. "That does not create a contract. It creates a memory." He paused briefly. "And we do not forget." The channel remained quiet. Thalen felt the weight of those words settle in a way that no formal alliance ever could. "What happens now?" he asked. The human glanced briefly to the side, as if checking something beyond the frame. "Now," he said, "we return to where we were." Thalen understood. "You will disappear again." "Yes." There was no attempt to hide it. No effort to make it sound like anything else. "Will we see you again?" Thalen asked. The human considered that. Then he gave a small, almost unnoticeable nod. "If you need us," he said. The answer was not a promise of presence. It was something else. A promise of response. The channel began to fade. "Wait," Thalen said. The human paused. Thalen held his gaze. "The galaxy believed you were gone," he said. "After today, they will know they were wrong." The human's expression did not change. But there was something in his eyes now. Something steady. "They can believe whatever they want," he said. Then, after a brief pause, he added, "We remember what matters." The transmission ended. In the space above the Zalari world, the human fleet began to move. Not forward, not outward, away. Their formations shifted, not into attack patterns, but into departure vectors. Engines flared with controlled intensity, the same deep blue light cutting through the darkness as they prepared to leave the battlefield they had just rewritten. Zalari ships watched in silence. No one tried to stop them. No one tried to follow. Because they understood. This had never been about conquest. It had never been about power. It had been about something far older. The human ships aligned. Space bent around them. And then, one by one, they were gone. No lingering signal. No traceable path. Just absence. On the surface below, the fires continued to fade. Repair ships moved through the atmosphere, stabilizing what remained, rebuilding what could be saved. Survivors emerged from shelters, stepping into a world that had nearly ended, and somehow had not. Above them, the sky was no longer filled with enemies. It was clear, quiet, alive. Admiral Thalen stood in the command chamber, looking at the now empty space where the human fleet had been. They came back, one of his officers said softly. Thalen nodded. Yes, he said. Not for glory, not for recognition, not for reward. He looked at the display one last time, at the place where the battle had turned. They came back because they said they would. The room fell silent again. But this time, it was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of understanding. Somewhere, far beyond the reach of sensors and maps, a species that the galaxy had declared extinct continued to exist, unseen, unclaimed, and unchanged in the one way that mattered most. They remembered, and when the time came, they returned.